everybody. So I'm going over the list of adult vaccines that are recommended in the United States from the CDC. And we see here that there's a mix here of both pulmonary diseases and others that are not pulmonary diseases. For example, vaccines for meningococcus are given primarily to prevent meningitis, a disease of the central nervous system. Measles, mumps, and rubella, of course, these are systemic diseases, but a number of these are respiratory diseases, and that's really going to be the focus of what I would like to talk about. And that includes the COVID vaccine, the influenza vaccines, the pneumococcal vaccines, and the respiratory syncytial virus vaccines. And there are multiple vaccines actually in each category, which we'll go through a little bit. And I will mention briefly at the end another vaccine, which is the zoster vaccine, which is important for adults because it can also trigger lung complications. And this is the current recommendations for adult vaccines in the US as of last year. What's going to happen in 2025 and going forward? It's not clear. The body that normally is the expert body that gives recommendations to the head of the CDC, as well as the FDA and the NIH, it has been disbanded by the current administration. And a new set of people have been invited onto that so-called expert panel, some of whom have long histories of being anti-vaccine ideologues. So this might change, but from my perspective, this is what the science tells us we should be doing. This is a list of all the vaccines for adults that can be given by age group. And you can see that it does vary by age group. Certain vaccines are much more important for people, for example, who are over 65. CF is in the special category of chronic diseases, particularly chronic lung diseases, where these recommendations that often apply only to older adults who don't have lung disease are extended to all adults. So most of what I'm going to say really applies to anybody with CF who's an adult. But this is just a rubric. I'm not going to go through the details of it with you. So let's just jump into the main respiratory diseases that we worry about. There are three viruses that are acting here. And what's shown here is the number of hospitalizations. It's represented here as per 100,000 people in the US over the last 5 or 6, 7 years. And what you see is that there is a very variable pattern for all of them. They all have seasonal characteristics, but the one that's most notable, of course, is COVID. And we see here the pandemic beginning in early 2020, big spike in 2020, then a larger one the next year, and a huge one when Omicron hit in 2022. And then since then, as most of the population has either been infected or had vaccines or both, a reduction, but still seeing these seasonal variations. And it's important to note that lately there's been another spike building in the Bay Area and California with COVID-19 in just the last few weeks. The other one is RSV, which is shown here in red. And you can see there that it had a very big peak in 2023 after sort of disappearing initially for a year or so. The first year of COVID was one of the most unusual years in terms of epidemiology, and that other viruses were kind of boxed out by COVID. It overwhelmed everything else. People didn't get the flu, they didn't get RSV, but they got a lot of COVID. And now we're getting back to a more normal pattern where a variety of different viruses are coming at their usual seasonal peaks. And the flu is shown in that sort of yellow or orange graph, and we can see also that there's been a large spike in 2023, and I'll show you 2024 in a minute. There's been a huge politicization of the COVID vaccine. It's been kind of melded into criticisms of public health measures that were taken, like school closures, lockdowns, business closures, things like this. And it's all been sort of put into a single basket so that I still think a distinct minority of the population, but a large number of people have become vaccine skeptical. And I just saw this week a poll that about 40% of Americans are not going to get a COVID vaccine this winter for the winter spike, at least according to what they said in this opinion poll. So that gives a kind of snapshot of where we are as a country right now. This shows the COVID hospitalization rates by age. And the important thing to note here is the age dependence of this disease. In the little box on the upper left, you see the rates in people over 75. And if you look at the y-axis, you can see those numbers are way off scale compared to everyone younger than 75, although the group that's over 65 is also very much separated from the group that below at 50 to 64, and then the others also quite low. So the highest rates are in very old people, and also, which people don't talk about much, babies under 6 months of age also being more susceptible. And incidentally, the current administration recommendations to not give COVID vaccines to children at all, no infants or children, which is a big change from what it used to be. This doesn't really apply to CF because the CF group is put in with the oldest patients in terms of susceptibility. And I'll show some of the data behind why that is. This was an international study that kind of summarized the experience, I think, through mid-2022 with COVID and CF. And what it's showing you is a way of presenting a risk as a statistical number, which is called an odds ratio. You'll see a black line there in the middle going up and down, which runs through 1 here. And then you'll see this horizontal line here and a number, a little diamond in the center. What this is giving is an odds ratio, that is, what is your risk? Is it twice normal? Is it less than 1, which would be protective effect? But besides the number itself, the bank gives us called a 95% confidence interval, which is a way of making you more confident that it's a real difference. If this bar is to the right of this line, then there's a statistically significant elevated risk. And the further right you go, the higher that risk is. So what you see in this particular study is that if you're over 40 or under 15, the risk is higher than it is if you're between 18 and 39 years of age. So that age effect that we see there in the normal population is something that's also apparent within the CF population. The older you are with CF, the higher the risk. Not just getting COVID, but being hospitalized, because we don't want to just look at the number of infections. That's really been one of the big problems. People looking at infections and saying the vaccines don't work because they don't prevent infection. The focus should be on, do they prevent bad disease? Do they prevent death? And we use hospitalization as a pretty good correlate of severe disease. They also looked at oxygen need as part of that. So age is one of the main factors. The other one that pops out is at the highest risk you see there is an FEV1. And the way that's cut off there, and again, these are arbitrary cutoffs that have been used for a long time to sort of categorize how sick people might be in terms of where they're staged in their CF journey. Below 40%, that risk is quite high. It's an odds ratio of almost 10 times more likely to get hospitalized if you get COVID, if your FEV1 is below 40% predicted. But, if it's better than that, if it's between 40 and 70, it's still elevated. The odds ratio there is still over 2.5 times if you have well-preserved FEV1. So age, lung function, there is certainly a contribution of nutrition with the BMI being used there. And the rest of these are not significant, except for the fact that modulator use, if you're on ETI, you're protected to some degree. That's the one in the middle there. It shows an odds ratio of 0.4. So about a 60% reduction in the risk of hospitalization, which is great because most people who are eligible are taking ETI now. Everyone with me on that so far? Okay. It was an interesting study that was done in England, published recently, that looked at death as sort of the hardest marker you can get from getting COVID. And what they did was to look at records that are available through the National Health Service in England of all chronic, not all, but many chronic diseases, and then looking at the risk of death, again, presenting this as an odds ratio compared to people that did not get COVID and comparing those that were vaccinated. And what you see is in those that were vaccinated, these are all adults in the United Kingdom that got vaccinated and got their booster. So they were fully vaccinated to yield the data for this. And on the number of diseases, which you see there circled in the red bar is cystic fibrosis, which shows that with COVID, the risk of death has an odds ratio of basically 1.6, and it does not cross that one line. So it's significantly elevated. So even compared to those that did not get vaccinated, it has a high risk. And those that did not get COVID with CF still had a slightly elevated risk there of basically 1.5, I think it says. So CF itself, we know, is a serious disease, and the risk of death is elevated despite COVID vaccination. But if you get COVID, despite getting a vaccine, your risk of death is also elevated. Another study looked at the effect of transplant status as well as lung function. And that you see there is 3 different categories: baseline lung function below 40%, 40 to 70, and then above 70. And then it's further split into patients that have not been and received any kind of transplant, most of these lung transplants, and those that have been transplanted. And it's easy to see there that if you look at the colored sections of the bars, which represent various levels of illness, hospitalization, with or without being in the ICU or with or without getting oxygen, those risks are much higher in those that have low lung function and higher in those that have been transplanted than those that have not needed a transplant, which is all common sense conclusions that one would make thinking about that. One question that arises these days is, given the fact that we've reached herd immunity, which people talked about a lot at the beginning, as how are we going to get out of the COVID pandemic? We're going to get out of it when everyone gets infected or vaccinated. So herd immunity is a term that's used for basically what portion of the population is protected by virtue of infection or vaccination. And as of about 2023, the majority of people in the United States, and probably in many parts of the world, had either been infected or vaccinated. So one question that has arisen has been, is it still necessary to use the vaccine at all? Because we've achieved herd immunity. Most people have some degree of seen the virus in some form, and therefore, do we need to still give vaccinations? You think back to flu, after decades and decades, actually centuries, but at least decades that we know about, yeah, people still need the flu vaccine. Why is that? There's variability. Well, it turns out that COVID is variable like influenza. It changes over time. And that at least suggests that you need to change the form of immunity that you have to meet the varying new types that emerge over time. So this is a study that looked at that and looked at the effectiveness of ongoing vaccination as measured by emergency room or urgent care visits by age groups, and shows that if you look at the far right, you see those odds ratios and confidence intervals. And what you see there is that no matter how long it's been since the last dose, going up to almost half a year before, the vaccines provide additional effectiveness in terms of reduction of, in this measurement, emergency room or urgent care visits between 20 and 40%, compared to the references, which means that those people that did not get a booster at all for that year. This is 2024 data. So it's pretty recent, and it suggests to me at least that the vaccines still have significant benefit even to people that have been getting vaccinated all along. And the takeaway for me from this would be to keep getting the COVID vaccine, at least for the foreseeable future, until we have future data on what's happening. It's entirely possible that a new variant, in general, they've been less virulent than the one before, but that's not always true. So you have to kind of keep your eyes open about that. But hopefully, as time goes on, this may be a situation where updated vaccines are not necessary, or more likely, if we continue to do the research, development of a vaccine that will cover variants. There are all ways to try and go after parts of the virus that don't change over time. If you can find the right thing to give the person for a vaccine, then you can prevent the disease, at least severe disease, no matter what the variant is at that time. We've not achieved that for influenza after decades of trying, so it may not happen with COVID either. And people at risk, and CF is in that category, I think should continue to get the COVID vaccine until we know that we've done better. There have been systematic reviews. This is one in CF of vaccination per se. I just put up the abstract here because it's really kind of straightforward what they're saying here. As you can see, one of the sentences says the COVID vaccines generally induced robust serological responses following second or third doses, although reduced levels were seen in lung transplant recipients. One of the things that happens from a transplant, whether it's lung, liver, any pancreas, whatever is used for transplantation, is that your immune system is weakened by the drugs that are necessary to prevent rejection. So there are many studies now looking at lung transplant recipients as well as other transplant recipients that show that the response to the vaccine is compromised to some degree. And obviously, there's variation between people, but that's important to just keep in mind. For people that have not been transplanted, the antibody responses that patients with CF make to the COVID vaccine is very strong and as good as the normal population, people that don't have CF. They do show some factors that influence that antibody response, including whether or not you had infection before, your age, whether you're using inhaled steroids and their dose has some effect, and most importantly, the immunosuppressive therapy used in transplantation. Second thing to note is that the adverse events, the side effects were predominantly mild. We've not seen any evidence of severe outcomes in people with CF that have received the COVID vaccine. So the overall recommendation is to use it and just be careful in terms of follow-up, and particularly folks that have had transplantation. There have also been studies looking at the particular side effects. This is one here of about 420 or so CF patients that got COVID vaccines, 2 doses, mRNA-based vaccines, that's the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines, looking at the particular side effects. And these basically mimic what you see in the general population. A very high degree of local reactions, which are usually very mild and self-limited, pain, sore arms, and swelling, sometimes your redness, but more serious reactions, very rare. And in terms of systemic reactions, pretty high number of fatigue and headache outcomes, which go away with a few days. And malaise and myalgia also part of that. Fever up at 10%, so that it's not insignificant, just something to remember, and goes up to about 30% after the second dose. So you can expect to have these, and I guess many of the folks here have gotten your vaccines and had some of these side effects. We've not seen any myocarditis, which is one of the most talked about side effects with COVID vaccines. The numbers that are involved are so rare that in the CF, there's not enough people with CF in the world to show up in any statistical analysis in terms of that being a side effect. But as far as I know, no actual case reports of that. And the myocarditis that's occurred with COVID vaccines in people without CF have been restricted almost entirely to younger men. And the reasons for that are not entirely clear, but the outcome is good for those people. There's been really no significant serious long-term effects. The myocarditis, that infection of the heart muscle, resolves over a period of a couple of days to weeks. Influenza. So this is looking at influenza flu illness over the last 15 years or so. And you see there's this year-by-year variation, which depends in large part upon exactly what strain of the flu emerges. This is another instance where the government traditionally has relied on experts to look at data as it emerges around the world and do their best guess as to what's going to be the dominant strain for the following year. Sometimes the guesses are right on target. Other times they're inaccurate. And that has some impact on whether or not we have a bad flu season. Of course, the other factor is how many people are actually getting the vaccine. In general, most people in the States, we've not had this kind of politicization. Most people understand that flu can be a serious illness and they get vaccinated, especially older folks and those with chronic conditions. But you'll notice last year we had a pretty bad flu year compared to prior years. And we don't yet know what it's going to look like this winter, but we should be prepared for the possibility of another bad flu year coming up. One of the important questions that has bothered people taking care of folks with CF for a long, long time has been, what is the impact of these respiratory viruses on pulmonary exacerbations? It's a hard thing to nail down, and the evidence is mainly epidemiologic rather than cause and effect. So what you do is you show an association rather than proving that's the actual cause of the exacerbation. Probably the best study that's looked at this is the one I'm showing here, which used the CFF patient registry for the years 2003 to 9, studying over 20,000 patients. And I'll try and walk you through this very briefly. On the left-hand side, you see a graph figure there that has two lines that represent the illnesses that we see in terms of exacerbations. In the open circles, the lower number are the kids and the higher number are the adults. And what you see there is this variation that is seasonal in characteristic, always higher in the winter when we have the traditional spikes of respiratory viruses. The data that was collected during this period included tests for flu and RSV in the respiratory secretions, usually in the sputum. And what they show here are these spikes that you see for both RSV in the gray and several different flu strains shown in the yellow, red, and I guess it's blue. And you see the same kind of pattern. They overlay each other. They're both winter viral peaks. In looking at the association of those viral, so these are the times when you detect more virus in the patient than in another time of year when you're also checking for it. So there's a seasonal peak, and there's a significant association shown on the lower right there, mainly for flu in terms of the association with exacerbations. In kids, it's significant. In children, but doesn't reach statistical significance in adults, which tracks RSV infection in general. It's a disease that occurs mostly in either young babies or old people. It really leaves everyone else out, where it becomes just merged with the common cold kind of thing in terms of symptomatology. So this is strong evidence that both flu and RSV are associated with pulmonary exacerbations. You all know that when you get admitted or even treated out as an outpatient for an exacerbation, you're usually treated with an antibiotic that will hit the bacteria that are cultured, but of course have no effect on these respiratory viruses. The viruses are probably acting to increase the background inflammation that makes the lung obstruction worse. Whether they're actually causing the bacteria to be more virulent or multiplying more, that's unclear. But at least there's this association, which I think is real, and which links these viruses to exacerbations. Because we know exacerbations are really one of the most important factors in determining the long-term course of CF. It's obviously important to try and reduce exacerbations. One of the things we love about ETI is that it reduces exacerbations by 50–60%. If we can stay free of these viral infections, we can also have a big effect on exacerbations. And to do that, we need vaccination. So what about flu vaccines themselves? This gets a little complicated because there are a lot of different flu vaccines out there. Most people just show up at their clinic and get the vaccine that the clinic is using. But I thought it'd be useful to just kind of go over the fact that it's really a pretty complicated, diverse set of medications that are used here. The flu virus can be grown in egg yolk. It can be grown in a cell system of some kind, an in vitro cell system, or you can make it from scratch using recombinant DNA technology. All these things are used and have resulted in vaccines that are being used. For the last season, 24-25 season, only one new vaccine was offered, and that is the one that's shown there, which has 2 type A flu strains and 1 type B strain. Again, based on what people thought was going to be the most important variants that go around the world in the winter for that year. The CDC has recommended using the normal flu vaccine in people that are up to 65. But if you're over 65 and if you have a high-risk condition, there's another set of flu vaccines that are available. They're called high-dose vaccines. There's actually 3 of them on the market that you see there: Fluzone, Flublok, and Fluad, made by 2 different companies. And the thing about these flu vaccines for the more susceptible population is that they have a higher amount of the flu antigen, the thing that stimulates the antibody response. In most, like in our clinic, we've always used Fluzone, I believe. The others are less commonly used. And you get a higher antigen dose, which means you may get a bit more side effects in terms of the local swelling and pain because you're getting a higher dose of that particular antigen. There's also a live flu vaccine you may have heard of where you get a nasal spray, which is called FluMist. It's currently recommended for people between 2 and 49 years of age, but it's not recommended for people with CF. You should get the injection form of the flu vaccine. And the reason for that is that there may be situations where your immunity is not so robust in CF that possibly would make you more susceptible to the vaccine replicating and causing illness itself. That's a risk of live attenuated vaccines. Normal, healthy people who have intact immunity don't have to worry about this. So it's safe for most folks, but not recommended for CF, just on general principles of that kind. So annual flu vaccines are still important. Just citing some things we know from the literature. People have looked at the antibody responses. Folks with CF make very good antibody responses to flu vaccine, just as they do with the COVID vaccine. Surveys, at least as of 2010 or so, have shown very good numbers with over 90% of people with CF accepting the flu vaccine, and the side effects reported are generally typically mild. And finally, there have been studies looking at what happens if you do get vaccinated versus not, and yes, the flu does get ameliorated to some extent if you've been vaccinated. Doesn't mean you're not going to get it. Just like with COVID, doesn't mean you're not going to get it, but it does mean less serious disease. And flu still kills a lot of people each year, mostly older folks. So it's nothing to play around with. The last thing I think I'll say about flu is that there is something called bird flu. Have you all heard of bird flu? There's a lot of fear about this. This could be the next pandemic. Bird flu has a mortality rate of 40 to 50%, which is sky high. So far, it has not jumped from person to person. There have been a couple individuals who have caught it, in the poultry industry and elsewhere. And there is, at this time, no vaccine for it that's generally available. So if we suddenly have a bird flu epidemic, we're going to have a replay of the COVID, but it could be worse. Okay, RSV. That stands for respiratory syncytial virus, another respiratory virus. This has been around. It's been recognized for about 60 to 70 years. You see the structure there on the left. And it's an RNA. That's the part that will replicate by taking over the cell. It has to get into the cell. So to get into the cell, it uses, in particular, 2 proteins on the glycolipid surface of the virus. These are called the fusion protein and the attachment protein, or F and G. And the F protein in particular has been shown to be protective. It produces antibodies that protect against it. And they've also been conserved so that it will protect against all different strains of RSV, and there are different strains in different parts of the world. RSV vaccine was developed in the 1960s and got as far as a clinical trial in babies because the main concern for RSV at that time particularly was the fact that infants are very susceptible to RSV. They get a disease called bronchiolitis, which is an asthma type, very serious breathing problem. And the vaccine, when it was given, produced a paradoxical effect of the babies who got vaccinated got sicker than the placebo patients. So the research was stopped, and it was in limbo for a good 40 years. And then something happened in the 2010s, which was an understanding of what happens when the virus hits the cell. So what you see there in the upper right-hand portion of this slide is a graphic that displays a change in the conformation or shape of one of these proteins, the F protein, that allows it to fuse with the cell. And what you see there is the post-fusion state on the right. That was the one that was in the original vaccine. What they discovered was that, and this depended on technical developments over that period, in particular X-ray crystallography that allows you to actually see what the structure looks like in real terms. And you see there that it's a very different look. And it turns out that that pre-fusion state produces antibodies that are protective. The post-fusion state produces antibodies that actually make the inflammation worse. And this realization led to the ability of several big pharma companies to develop vaccines that were based on the pre-fusion state of that protein F. So that's the big advance that occurred relatively recently in the teens. And now we have several RSV vaccines, which are shown here. Yeah, it's really important thing that really makes you appreciate that science can make a difference, that you can go from doing something which, yeah, produced an unwanted outcome to something which actually produced a very good outcome, and that's shown here on this slide. We have 3 companies that have produced vaccines based on this pre-fusion RSV F protein. GSK has one, Pfizer, and Moderna. The Moderna one is an mRNA vaccine, actually. These were recently approved. You can see here that the first 2 were approved at the same time in May 2023. And their approval was based in part on phase 3 studies done in older adults. So what you can see here is that the Arexvy or GSK vaccine is listed as recommended for people over 60, but also people who are 50 to 59 years at a higher risk for lower respiratory tract diseases, and CF is on that list. So in a clinical study that was done, it reduced the rate of lower respiratory tract disease by 83% and severe lower respiratory tract disease, that is hospitalization, oxygen treatment, by 94%, very effective. A similar vaccine from Pfizer, also approved at the same time, was also approved for people over 60, but also this one's different. They did a separate study in pregnant women. The idea being if you give the vaccine to pregnant women, it will protect their babies from getting bronchiolitis. So it was approved for both of those indications. And then third thing, it was approved down to age 18 in all people at higher risk for lower respiratory tract diseases. And that was approved later, October 24, pretty recently. And the reason I mention that is if you're a CF adult, you would fall into the group that's formally under the recommendation for the Pfizer RSV vaccine, because that covers everyone down to age 18. The clinical results are similar. Lower respiratory tract disease decreased by 65% and severe disease by 89%. So very good protection. And then very recently, the Moderna mRNA-based pre-fusion vaccine, also approved in adults over 60. Similar results, lowering any disease by 84%. So bottom line, if you're an adult with CF, you should get an RSV vaccine. So those are the viral vaccines that are available, COVID, RSV, influenza. If you're an adult with CF, it's best to get all of those. If you have transplants, there's some complicating factors, particularly for COVID, and trying to look at antibody response to make sure you have enough protection. Turning to bacteria, there are respiratory bacteria. Everyone knows about Pseudomonas. We know about staph. We don't have vaccines for either of those things. but there are several vaccines for respiratory bacterial pathogens, such as pneumococcus and Haemophilus influenza. One of the interesting things that came out from studies that I did many years ago, looking at antibody responses, we looked at Haemophilus in a study we published in 1987, you see on the left. And what we showed was that people with CF did not produce as good an antibody response to the Haemophilus capsular vaccine. That problem was solved when so-called conjugate vaccines were developed. Conjugate vaccine takes that capsule, which is a sugar, and attaches it to a protein, which is strongly antigenic, strongly stimulating the immune system. And the conjugate vaccines for bacteria are now part of that immunization schedule that we started with for both Haemophilus and pneumococcus. So that problem was solved. The study done in CF patients on the right from the UK showed a similar impairment of the responses to the capsule of the pneumococcus. So that leads to a concern that maybe pneumococcus is a danger for folks with CF if they have not been vaccinated. The pneumococcal vaccine, this is the most complicated of all because there's a lot of these different vaccines available. Several conjugates are on the market now, and I list some of them here. The number on these, so these are called PCV, a pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. And the number that follows that indicates the number of serotypes or different strains of pneumococcus that are covered by that vaccine. We started with one that covered 7 serotypes, then one with 13, then it went to 15, then it went to 21 and 20. So the more the merrier, because you get better coverage by covering more of these serotypes. And the current recommendations are to use the more recent conjugate vaccines that cover more of these pneumococcal serotypes. In addition, in certain categories of people at higher risk, the conjugate vaccine is complemented by also giving the capsular sugar or polysaccharide vaccine, which is called Pneumovax, which is the one that we first started with a couple of decades ago, still out there. It has 23 strains covered in terms of the sugars, but it's not conjugate. It's not linked to a protein, so it's not as highly stimulating or immunogenic as the conjugate vaccines. So just to summarize a lot of very confusing data, the conjugate vaccine is recommended for adults that are 65 and people at higher risk who are adults, and that includes CF as a category. Because the schedule involves people that have gotten these vaccines before, there's a bunch of different recommendations based on how long it's been since your last vaccine and which kind of conjugate vaccine you got, and it can get very complicated. Just to summarize that a little bit, this is a recent CDC figure that shows different options for people that have gotten various pneumococcal vaccines at various times. But I think it's the simplest way you can state this is to make sure that you've had a conjugate vaccine within the last 10 years. I think we can do that. If it's been a long time, then you may want to get a revaccination, and there's an option to have it supplemented with the Pneumovax, the capsular vaccine also. But it's something that even I, looking at this, get confused about. There's so many different options, and this actually even makes it worse if you have an immunocompromising condition. For example, if you've gotten a transplant, it gets a little more complicated in terms of what is recommended based on which one you used, which one you had before, and how long it's been since you got it. But you can go to these figures and sort of get guidance that way. At least ask your doc to do that if you have any question about that. They're all available on the CDC website. So the bottom line is that pneumococcal vaccines are recommended. How many people have heard of the Cochrane database? Cochrane studies? Okay. Cochrane studies come out of England. They basically are people that take a hard and skeptical look at things doctors do. And they try and figure out how good the evidence is for this, for a particular practice that exists. When we look at pneumococcal vaccines for CF, the most recent Cochrane review came out in about almost a decade ago, 2016. And basically, no trials were identified from that, which allowed conclusions about the efficacy of routine pneumococcal immunization. But many countries now include it in routine child vaccination schedule. So the likelihood of a randomized controlled trial is very low. And this gets to a question about, gets us back into politics. The person that was hired and left and came back to run the vaccine program for the CDC, a doctor from UCSF named Vinay Prasad, is a person that believes if you haven't done a randomized controlled trial, you should not accept any recommendation, basically, and was very critical about the design of COVID studies based on critiques of some of the trials that were done, as well as any trial which is so-called observational in nature, which doesn't include a placebo control group. The problem is there are situations where you're never going to be able to do that from a practical point of view. And the pneumococcal vaccine is an excellent example of that because pneumococcal disease is very important vaccine to give kids. If you don't get it, your risk for meningitis as well as pneumococcal pneumonia is much higher. So there's no way we're going to stop giving pneumococcal vaccines in kids in order to do randomized controlled trials in adults. And so when you go to a view of efficacy based only on randomized controlled trials, you get conclusions like this, which is we can't draw any conclusions. However, there was one study I found in the literature, which was done in Calgary, up in Canada. They have a pretty big CF center there. They had 318 adults enrolled in this study. And only 5% had what they felt were short or long-term deterioration or chronic infection with pneumococcal disease. What they didn't really clearly state was the actual vaccine status of all those people. They didn't go and see what they got, when they got it. They certainly didn't measure antibody responses. So again, we're left really not knowing for sure. But just based on what we know about the susceptibility of folks with CF to lung pathogens, it's a vaccine that does not cause any real problems at all. So it's recommended. The only other vaccine that I want to just mention briefly, and then we can open it up for any discussion you guys want to have, is the shingles vaccine. And a couple of reasons to do this. This is something that is recommended for older adults. It's a very important disease to try and prevent for a couple of reasons. One is it's one of the most painful diseases you can have. I don't know if anybody has had shingles. I had one episode. It's an awful thing to have. And there are certain people that have what's called post-herpetic neuralgia, where it becomes a chronic disease, a chronic pain disease, which is horrible. And it's completely preventable with this herpes zoster vaccine. This is something that most of us carry, and then we can get reactivation during times of stress or illness, and then you can get shingles, and it's no fun at all. So I can strongly recommend people who are at least 50 years to get it. If you're between 18 and 50, if you have CF, your immune system is not really weakened, but it can be weakened if you have low lung function, if you're taking corticosteroids or other immunosuppressive drugs. So in that case, you might want to look at that and get it earlier than starting at age 50. And it just involves 2 doses, which are given sometime apart, usually a couple months apart, and then it provides lifelong protection. And it can be given with these other vaccines that we've talked about. There are other ways to try and prevent not getting it, which involve the things that we all learned about it. Well, people with CF have known this for their lives, but society learned about this in 2020. Distancing, masking, washing, those kinds of things remain measures that can help, get infected. There are medications that can be used. So there are antiviral medications that are available for both influenza and COVID, Paxlovid for COVID in particular. And for influenza, a number of different medications are available. The thing about the viral medications is the need to give them within at least 2 to 3 days at most of symptoms appearing. So you have to start soon. The longer you wait, the less effective they are. There are no medications yet for RSV infection. Well, that's not totally true. There is one, but it's for people that are in the hospital. They basically mainly for babies, and it's involving inhaled antiviral medication. Yeah, I don't know for sure, but my guess is that it reflects how much RSV is being tested for. During that time, people began to do the antigen testing more and more frequently. And now it's fairly routine particularly if you get admitted, you're going to get a respiratory viral panel. At least in many places, you'll get a respiratory viral panel as part of your lab work. Okay. So my guess is it reflects the increasing use of the test. Right. But I don't know for sure. Great question. This has been looked at, and both the amount of antibody produced and the time it lasts are less in people that have been on immunosuppressive medication. So in that particular circumstance, it's important to try and get tested to see if you have mounted a sufficient response. It can vary in terms of how long that lasts, and it may be suboptimal at its peak. Yeah, I mean, the shingles vaccine was the most painful vaccine I got, and I think a lot of people have more of a reaction to it, possibly because I had shingles before I got it, years before I got it. I think you can. It's possible, and many people do this, is to just take some Advil a couple hours before you get your shot, and maybe another dose or two afterwards. Certainly should help with fever and pain, inflammatory pain. The more itchy kind of reactions sound more allergic to me, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. Most people can get what's called large local allergic reactions, and then they're at risk to have that repeat if they get the same thing again. So that's a bit of a yellow flag. Obviously, systemic reactions are a red flag, anaphylaxis, then you don't get the vaccine. You never see it. You should not see it again. But that's very rare.